Okay, guys, welcome back to the January 30th or whatever reviews 2024. My third, Descartes' Discourse on Method and the Meditations. This is mandatory reading in any philosophy degree. All modern philosophy starts with this book, whether rightly or wrongly. I suggest wrongly because Descartes and, as I've said, Leibniz were deeply rooted in scholasticism. Were deeply rooted in the Thomistic Aristotelian philosophy and theology of the High Middle Ages. Now, it's not to say that Descartes doesn't start something new, but it's difficult to figure out what the newness is. And you know what? I hate to say it because this is not my expertise, but the guy who wrote the introduction to this edition, let me just see here. I hope I'm getting this right. Yeah. The guy who wrote this introduction, what the heck's his name? Sutcliffe. I'm sure he knew a lot more about Descartes than me. You know what? When he was writing his introduction to this, I found it weak. I don't think he knows. I don't think I like his answer to what is new about Descartes. I didn't buy it. I think he's wrong in several ways. Now, if I'm going to correct him and put a better answer to the question, what is new in Descartes, I would point not necessarily to his skepticism, because skepticism is old. His famous cogito ergo sum? Well, 1200 years earlier, Augustine said, si fallor sum. And Descartes also says si fallor sum. Si fallor sum means if I err or if I make a mistake, I exist, right? Which is the same as, in a way, I think, therefore I am. If I think, therefore I am. If I think incorrectly, I'm a thinker, therefore I exist, right? So Augustine said si fallor sum a long time ago, and that's not the originality. That was part of Augustine's beginning of his epistemological journey, just like it was for Descartes. Augustine wants to know what truly exists, right? Just like every philosopher does. And he points out these main fundamental things. Now, what's the discourse on method and what are the meditations? They're not completely distinct. They're kind of like him going over the same material just from different angles and elaborating on them in different ways. So I think it's pretty easy. Like, you can kind of see they're a bit redundant in a way, that you can point pretty easily to Descartes' fundamentals. And his fundamentals are, okay, I'm gonna doubt everything that exists unless I really have good grounds for believing it exists. And he begins with, I think, therefore I am. And then he says that the existence of God is also logically deductive, logically logically demonstrable, and Descartes has, I saw him making two different arguments. Maybe there's more. Maybe I wasn't reading it closely enough. I saw two arguments. Okay, I'm going to point out two of them. Number one, things can't come from nothing. Okay, that's the standard argument, one of Aristotle's standard arguments, right? that there has to be a first mover, right? So he takes that idea, but he also takes another one, which I would say is more of Anselm's argument of, I can't remember what it's called, but basically, God is the greatest thing that can be conceived. It's greater to exist than not to exist. Therefore, God must exist. So Descartes takes that very troubling argument, troubling, unpersuasive argument, but I think he puts a twist on it. Descartes says that, okay, so he plays that little linguistic game, and I'll call it a linguistic game, and I think that Plato uses these linguistic games a lot too, right? And I don't trust them completely. It's hard to argue against their validity, but I think they're invalid. But Descartes' twist is he looks at the idea of infinity. Descartes says we can't come up with this idea from anywhere else than from God, because there's nothing in our experience of the world, there's nothing in ourselves that shows us this idea of infinity. So you can't get something from nothing. Therefore, God himself teaches us about infinity, about his own infinity. Okay? Again, I don't like that idea. I find it interesting, but let's look back to my previous book review a minute ago. What will Berkeley say about this? And he does address it specifically. Berkeley says, and Descartes deals with this too, but interesting. Berkeley says, what's infinity? What's the idea of infinity? It has no structure. It is, what is it? We don't have an idea. We don't have an image of infinity. We don't have a clear and distinct idea, which is a hallmark of Descartes' method, as I said. Clear and distinct. Remember, Descartes is going to doubt the existence of everything that he doesn't have a really good reason to believe in. He begins with himself, he proves his own existence, then he proves God's existence, and then he goes on and talks about clear and distinct ideas. Okay? Maybe that's legitimate, but then Berkeley will come along and say, we don't have clear and distinct ideas. As I said for a few minutes ago, Descartes will say, yeah, we have distinct ideas about a triangle, right? We can say that, every triangle has to have interior angles equaling 180 degrees. Okay, that sounds pretty distinct. But then Berkeley will come along and say, no, you don't have that idea at all. Those are words, and that's a logical puzzle, like 2 + 2 = 4. But what's the 2-ness and what's the 4-ness and what's the plusness? That, 2 tomatoes plus 2 tomatoes is 4 tomatoes. I can kind of picture that, sort of, but not really. Like, picture 4 tomatoes. What does that look like? He says it's even worse when it comes to more complex ideas. And I think this comes up in Descartes, and I think that later Berkeley reflects on it and argues against it. I think it's Descartes who says we can picture, for instance, a line segment being divided up, say, into 4 pieces, right? We can see it being divided up into half, okay? Then we can picture it being divided up into 4. And you know what? I think Descartes talks about shapes. So let's talk about triangles, 3 sides. Squares, 4 sides. Octagons, 8 sides. A chiligon has 1,000 sides. You can't picture that, right? Can you picture a 100-sided object? I definitely can't. Can you picture an 8-sided object? Well, I think of a stop sign, but really, what am I looking at when I think of a stop sign? I can look at a stop sign and then I have a really clear idea what it is. But then I just close my eyes and think about a stop sign. It's not really that clear, right? So not only does Berkeley say you don't have an idea of a chiliagon or an octagon, square or triangle, you don't have a clear and distinct idea of any of those things. You only have experiences of whiteness or hardness or whatever. So, but those are the basic building blocks of Descartes' methodology. Okay, so that's his philosophical method, okay? He begins skeptically and then takes very cautious steps forward to proving the existence of stuff. Well, this is not just, doesn't have a name like Principles of Knowledge. It has Discourse on Method and the Meditations. So Descartes is not talking about epistemology per se, like Berkeley is narrowing in on. He's talking about an education method as a whole, right? So, and he uses, I guess in a way he uses, as a rationalist, his chief analogies, I think, are geometric, are mathematic, and one of Descartes' great accomplishment was optics, theories of optics, of light and all that business. So he has these very mathematical and geometrical analogies for education, and you can see it, how he works rationalistically through reasoning to knowledge of things. And so Discourse on Method doesn't just mean principles of knowledge. It means how should we educate ourselves? How should education be like? And one good thing that the guy who writes the introduction to this book says is that Descartes was taught by the Jesuits, and he had and the Jesuits took education theory very seriously, and Descartes admired that in them, and he was elaborating on the good points of that education and education as he would have it, and so on. So Discourse on Methods and the Meditations is much more than just proving the existence of the world and of the things we see and experience. It's a whole meditation on learning, on pedagogy as a whole, right? So this is interesting, but I wouldn't say it's the greatest of all books of pedagogy, but I think, yeah, it is a milestone in the history of philosophy, but it is less philosophically satisfying, I think, than, say, some other philosophers. Like I enjoyed Berkeley much more. Locke is more satisfying. Kant is more satisfying and perplexing, and Hume as well. So, but again, there you go. It's an easy read. It's an easier read than most of the primary works of philosophy. But it is less satisfying, I find, than many, because as you should note, that Descartes was the guy everybody was tearing down. Everybody after Descartes was talking about Descartes. And he was sort of the Bible, so to speak. Like, he was the object that every subsequent philosopher of the 17th century was picking on, because he wrote the textbook and everyone else was attacking it. Okay? So who can sustain that much criticism? But Descartes is very picturesque. He's very approachable to someone who doesn't have a lot of philosophical background, because he doesn't use a lot of scholastic language. He doesn't use a lot of specialized terminology. He rejects that terminology because he wants to start fresh. He doesn't want to take other people's ideas and current ongoing themes and subjects and terminology. He wants to start afresh and say, all right, how do we really know things, right? So that's the attractiveness of Descartes. And for someone who wants to start out in philosophy, and especially epistemology, so our theory of knowledge, this is a great place to start, even though his answers are much less satisfying, in my opinion, than other philosophers who are building on him. Yes, standing on his shoulders, sure. Okay, guys, I have one more video today, one more review, and let's do that.